Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. So my name is Juniper Harrower, and I'm an artist and ecologist. And I'm really interested in multi-species interactions under different states of change, so climate change, different social conditions. So today I'm going to share with you some work from a recent artist residency I had with a plant ecology lab at UC Berkeley. And this was really exciting for me because in addition to being a multimedia artist, I'm also a plant ecologist. So was a really fun way that I got to explore all of my many interests together with this work. The plants are paying close attention. They're not just passively existing within their environment, but they're really sensitive beings, and they're assessing and adapting and responding to their environments. The plants are also, they're responding to the interferences and the fractures that are imposed by the built environment. And they overcome challenges. They're attracting sexual collaborators with both really quiet and explosive displays. And they can also signal and communicate in very highly complex ways through hormones and also through vast underground partnerships with symbiotic fungi. So they've been existing and evolving on this planet for millions of years. But now they have to be, incredibly resilient to persist through all of the rapid changes that are now happening on our planet. So I'm really interested in how we can open up to the wisdom of plants and what they have to teach us. And so I approach my research questions as both an ecologist and an artist through working with different plants and all of the multi-species assemblages that they exist in. So in decentering Western traditions of human exceptionalism, Indigenous ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, with her book Braiding Sweetgrass, she reminds us that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the ways that they live. They teach us by example. Plants have been on the earth far longer than we have been, and they've had time to figure things out. So I was invited to join Benjamin Blonder's lab at UC Berkeley to ponder the ideas of plant teachings. And it was there through discussions with the researchers that I became really interested in how plants use light, how they're using light to sculpt form over deep time, and the histories that are embedded in those forms. Plants are really incredible alchemists, and they make life on the planet possible by creating substance from sunlight and CO2 and water. But there are trade-offs the plant makes through their forms and their biochemistry. So for example, a plant might put energy into producing different compounds to protect itself from being eaten or from diseases, and then conversely put less energy into its circulatory complexity, which would then change its internal shapes and the patterns of its leaf. And some of these compounds can be poisonous, medicinal, or they can be intoxicating for humans. We have these really long histories of seeking out and cultivating these potent plants. So drawing on these ideas of light creating form and plant histories, with this work, I'm asking, what are the roles that plants play in forming our identities, and how do we in turn influence their ways of living? So with this sculpture, Botanical Entanglements, that was installed at the UC Berkeley Botanical Gardens in March 2022, I was thinking about these questions, and I wanted to approach this project as a community member and a collaborator with plants, but then also to spend time learning about the localized ecologies and the histories that shape and form some of the medicinal plants in my neighborhood. So all plants have inherited genetic adaptations that they pass down between generations. So that's like a certain leaf shape. But they also have environmental adaptations that aren't genetically fixed and that can be turned on in response to the environment. And so these are things like leaf size, thickness, color, orientation. The next leaf that emerges is really a direct response in what's happening locally. So the plant itself is a sculptural response to its deep histories, but it's also responding in present time to its local environment. So I spent a lot of time learning about, and observing different plant lives and their neighborhoods and visitors and collecting images of the community members there. So this work was about a close observation and a slowing down and being together with plants. And spending time with plants, I was thinking about light as a material and as a medium. I became interested in how light was fixed and how the filtering of light through the natural and the built environment impacts plant forms. And so I photograph and I sketch the ecologies and the built environment that impacts these plant forms. I'm recording in this way, recording a history of our shared ecosystem. So for example, the birds that would visit the area and lichen growing, people and other plants living nearby, drains, stairs, all of these things that compose the different plant environments that I was studying and making a collection of this local habitat. I then embed those images into the leaf through a chlorophyll printing process. And that's in that way, I'm actually using the plant's own phytochemistry to create the image within the leaf. And so you'll notice everything on, here was black and white. And that's, I print that onto acetate, which is clear. And then I use that to cover the leaf and I place it in the sun. And the leaf is then acting like a photosensitive material. So here's an example of one of the images from that process. And it takes a lot of experimentation. Each leaf behaves totally differently in this process. The age of the leaf matters, the kind of leaf that I'm using matters. The chloroplasts are actually moving in response to the light, but they can also shift their form, which affects light transmittance, reflectance, the different colors that you see. There's photo bleaching happening. And this shows up, and that leaves an image embedded within the leaf. And so this process that I call sun printing is, it's a recording of the light through the original manifestation of the light-giving form apparatus, which are chloroplasts. And so also remembering, of course, that the shape of the leaf itself is a sculptural response to light. And so through this process of sun printing, the image is then placed in direct relation to the carrier that holds it. Here's another leaf with some of the local detritus where this plant was growing. I even tried this collaboration with of sun printing with living leaves, and it also works. So to preserve these incredibly delicate leaves from this process, I decided to create a documentation and an archiving of this work. And so I scanned each sun printed leaf and I printed them onto mulberry paper. I then dipped them in beeswax with resin, and this renders the leaves transparent to allow the light to pass through. But it also links to the history of religious artworks like encaustics, and it begins this gesture towards worship and spirituality through nature, which is something else that I'm interested in with this work, and I'll talk about more. So I see this as an act of caretaking and reverence, as well as storytelling. The images, they appear like oracle visions in the leaf, perhaps inspiring new meanings and understandings of the ecosystems and the particular forms of our interconnectedness. And in this case, the leaf becomes this archival process, and it becomes a facsimile of the original leaf and this act of preservation. And this sculpture becomes a hybrid being, but it's also an archive of ecological histories within the local plant community and species interdependence. The branches are sculpted from manzanita, brought together, and this was from a very old tree from my sister's home that collapsed in California following one of our last epic droughts. And then we had this atmospheric river that dumped so much water, and the thirsty tree just became overwhelmed by that deluge of water, and it drank it up and then toppled over under the weight of all of that climate imbalance. The roots are woven with deconstructed silk to reference mycorrhizal networks and the complexity of species associations. And this is part of my work as an ecologist also. But then it also connects it materially to the other pieces. The silk is actually shedding from the hanging pieces that I'll talk about later, but it's also referencing material transformations. Mycorrhizal fungi are incredible. They form symbiotic associations with plants, and they actually grow into the plant roots and then forage out in these vast underground webs to get access to water and nutrients. And then they trade those back to the plant in exchange for plant sugars for carbon. The trees can communicate in some cases underground between these vast fungal networks, plants and trees. And this is actually one of my areas of specialization as an ecologist and something I worked on extensively with Joshua trees in the Mojave Desert. But to take it back to leaves, so continuing with the theme of organic transformations, I then partially decay the real sun-printed leaves with both organic and laboratory techniques. And so you'll see the leaf is balanced in a medium in the laboratory, and it's starting to make it transparent. It's decaying the leaf. And then I stain that leaf to visualize the deep plant evolution. And so you're starting to see the veins coming through. And so this is highlighting the leaf vein patterns, which is a technique that the researchers use in the Blonder Lab. And I wanted to bring both of these ways of thinking about plant history together, the embedded localized histories that I printed with the sunlight, but then also these deep vein histories that you can start to see through staining the leaf veins and then using a microscope. So the dye that I use to stain the veins, this red magenta dye, it comes from cochineal, which is made from the squished insects that feed on the prickly pear cactus, and they turn this deep red or bright fuchsia color depending on the acid in the wash. And cochineal has a fascinating history culturally in many places. As a dye, it became a major colonial commodity that was collected and traded during periods of conquest and colonialism, and it's deeply connected to histories of violence and imperialism. There's also more just recent contemporary uproar with cochineal as it was used as a food dye. Starbucks strawberry frappuccinos, people got really upset when they learned they were unintentionally drinking insects. And so there had to be some changes to the FDA regulation of this as a food dye. But then, also thinking about using this dye within the leaves, I found this materiality to be a really interesting example of the entanglements of human industrialization and our abstractions of these multi-species interactions from botanical worlds. And I think there's some really interesting multi-species enmeshments that are happening in the act of fusing these insect bodies into the plants. But this is something I'm still thinking about with this work. So by partially decaying these leaves here in Delicate Transitions, I wanted to create a tension between the evolutionary histories found in those emerging leaf veins, but also the local histories and their impacts on the plant form. Decay is also an act of transformation. It's a releasing of light and an energetic returning and changing of form. So in this artwork, Delicate Transitions, the leaves are suspended in a kind of reformed, restructured net that I created out of silk strings. It's incredibly delicate. And it's grounded and supported by small river stones from the local Strawberry Creek, which is nearby where this work was installed, nearby the UC Berkeley Botanical Gardens, California. And I was really interested in using these stones to ground the work as they've been experiencing the changing landscape surrounding this area in creek time, slowly smoothing and weathering these stones across many, many, many centuries. And these threadings, these aesthetic and material and ecological, they all converge in multiple histories and stories. And they connect to the large leaf printed silk hangings that they shed from. So these are 12-foot silk hangings that were also installed in this work. And you can see the branches there in the corner, which were the other piece I explained earlier. So these large silk portals, the temple guardians, they were created by printing the images directly onto habitized silk. And they're based on the high resolution images of those decayed and stained leaves that I was showing. And so with this size, I was hoping that the veils would create portals, kinds of passageways between time, and that they would be able to share what's usually hidden from us. We don't get to see this immense complexity. And here we can stand before the incredible majesty of millions of years of evolution. I like that they stand over us in this space and they force us to look up. that scale shift really begins to make me feel small and reduce my feelings of human significance. We're looking at them at this size, the leaves begin to become bodies and circulatory systems and networks and modes of wayfinding. I was also reminded after creating them that chlorophyll in plants and hemoglobin in humans have these really almost identical chemical structures, and that there's just these fascinating structural repetitions through nature. So with these leaf portals, I was aiming to bring a sense of worship to the space. And I was also interested in breaking down some of the hierarchies that come with empirical modes of knowledge seeking, and how we can become less reductionist and more intimate with the different beings, the organisms that we work with in our scientific approaches. So perhaps to dwell a little bit in the spillage between science and mysticism, and the seen and the measured world versus other ways of knowing. It also made me think about how the scientific relationship to mystery is asymptotic. You'll never get it all figured out. And that's really wonderful. And so these tiny leaves are magnified at a large scale, but you'll notice that they're blurred and abstracted at the edges, both appearing and disappearing at the same time. And so this was a decision to provide some anonymity back to the plant as we take in each individual leaf. At first, when I first created the leaves at this scale, they felt so exposed. And through some conversations with other artists, it got me thinking about the idea of gaze and objectification and examination, this active display and uncovering, and the vulnerability that we're asking these beings to perform. Really the science gaze. And there's this complexity in looking and being looked at. What does it mean to be viewed through powerful institutions? And so as I was pondering this, I decided to obscure that act of looking a little bit as a gesture and give some privacy back to the individual plant in this process of searching. But also as a plant biologist, and working with and knowing closely many scientists, I also, absolutely know that the scientific approach to knowledge seeking and the work by many scientists really comes from a deep love of the natural world and its diversity of life forms, and a desire to dwell within and understand the great mysteries of life. And I see this as a really incredible act of care. And I hope that this also starts to point to some of the tension between artistic and science ways of looking, and the complications within that too. And so my artistic gesture of looking, of moderating our way of looking, it's continued through numerous embroidered tapestries that I faded the edge of the tapestry through hand stitching. And so then this begins to cover the shape of the leaf. And through this work, there's this process of learning the leaf language that informs some of my patterns of repetition. So in one sense, I'm obscuring the edge, thinking about the act of care of the obscuring of the leaf form, but then also this act of repeating and following the leaf veins and learning about the leaf language and letting that plant language inform my actions. And so I see this as an act of care and caretaking, and I'm thinking about, the intimate and the special things that we embroider on, and then of course, who does embroidery? The artistic act of embroidery then connects this to women's work, and the lineages of this as a women's art form. And I think that provides a really interesting tension between the legacies of women's work and the scientific process, which for so long has, was, and in many ways still is, dominated by men. And they are still definitely compensated more than women and or non-binary researchers. So this is a performative gesture and a work in progress, and I plan to continue embroidering this over time, this intimate act of touching and knowing the leaf and thinking about the leaf language. So next, we're then invited to turn our gaze explicitly towards human disruptions and their landscape effects by peering into the settler history of the land that is now the UC Berkeley Botanical Gardens, although I've rendered it in miniature. So using archival images of the Berkeley Strawberry Canyon, I colored the human activity in the environment the same shade of pink that I stained the leaves with. And so looking back, we see the dairy farm that once occupied this area. And perhaps we can imagine the changes of the land that it's gone through. And, from the time when the first indigenous tribes lived here for thousands of years, and they stewarded the land with very deep knowledge and understanding of plants, and the land that they shared, they shared their communities with. And we can imagine how those ecological relationships were severed and shifted through the violence of European colonialism and the forced attempts at erasures of this knowledge. Local tribes, they have many relearning efforts to keep this knowledge alive and reinvigorate it within their communities. And you can support those efforts through a Shumi land tax, that an initiative that's happening, and to rematriate the land. Some really important conversations that are going on. But then we've also seen this more recently with indigenous plant wisdom, for example, in areas such as fire management, that Western science and the government policy is really finally starting to get on board with. And then this is that image through the dissecting scope. So with this shrinkage of the settler history onto microscope slides, I was enjoying the confusion of scales between the small leaves that we're usually looking at under a lens, but instead expanded large and looming over us. And then these large human modified landscapes rendered really small, and how that might encourage a shifting of focus from the human stories back to plant lives. And finally, I also wanted to briefly mention the site specificness of this work in response to the Julia Morgan building that it was shown in. And I was invited to respond to this space with the work as well. And so the scale, some of the form, and the presence of light was absolutely informing decisions that I made it with the work and the materiality. So to bring all of this together, I hope that through this work, I've inspired you to think a little differently about plants as beings that we share communities and our homes with. It's my hope that by better understanding plants and our interconnectedness, that we really get moved to acts of care. Actions that are on behalf of life will absolutely transform the world around us, but then they also have the added benefit of healing ourselves. So I want to give thanks to everyone at the Blonder Lab and through the Berkeley Botanical Gardens who supported me with this work, but also to my family. Thank you so much. Please visit juniperharrower.com if you'd like to learn more about my research. Thank you.